Hey guys, so in this video we're going to be going over common osmosis and diffusion misconceptions, and this is a part of chapter 7, which is all about membrane structure and function. So a really common misconception is that diffusion is an important biological process at both large and small distances. But diffusion, it's not an effective means of transport across both small and large distances. And this misconception, it arises because we know that diffusion is responsible for the movement of molecules across cell membranes, and that might lead us to assume that diffusion is also going to serve as the primary transport mechanism in larger structures, like our tissues and organs. So when we're looking at this figure, what we see is that we have diffusion through two different distances working at the same rate and the same efficacy, but this is not correct. In reality, diffusion works effectively only over short distances. And an example of where we would see diffusion would be our plasma membrane. And our plasma membrane is only around 8 nanometers thick. But it's also important to recognize that diffusion, it's not exclusive to the plasma membrane. It also occurs intracellularly. And intracellular diffusion, it's going to facilitate the movement of molecules inside of the cytoplasm and then across organelle membranes. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing all of these molecules surrounding the cell. They're entering the cell through the plasma membrane, and then once they're inside of the cytoplasm, they're going to move wherever they need to. But what happens when distance becomes larger? Well, diffusion is going to no longer be an efficient transport method, and that's because it's going to become too slow to meet the biological needs. So the time required for diffusion can actually be expressed as a mathematical equation. And that's going to be that time is equal to distance squared. So for example, if it took us, let's say 15 milliseconds to travel 10 micrometers, how long will it take us to travel 30 micrometers? Well, time is equal to distance squared. So T is equal to 30 micrometers squared, which is going to be equal to 900. And when we divide this 900 by our original time, we're going to get that T is equal to 60 milliseconds. So it took us 15 milliseconds to travel 10 micrometers, but it's taking us 60 milliseconds to travel 30 micrometers. So it's taking us 9 times longer to travel 30 micrometers than it took us to travel these 10 micrometers. So this poses a problem. This exponential increase in time, it's going to make diffusion so impractical for moving substances over long distances. So our larger organisms, they had to come up with a different way of transporting molecules. And our larger organisms, they actually rely on something called transport systems. And an example of the transport system is going to be our circulatory system. And it's actually going to allow us to move our substances efficiently. So our circulatory system, it's an example of a bulk transport system. And this bulk transport system is going to overcome those limitations of diffusion by using pressure gradients to move large volumes of fluid. Because if we have to move blood from the heart to our extremities, that's an extremely large distance, and diffusion would not be able to do that fast enough. So while diffusion remains really important and essential for short distance molecular movement, organisms, they require specialized transport systems to function efficiently at that macroscopic level. So another misconception that we have is that osmosis and diffusion are fundamentally different. Many times, osmosis can be thought of something that only applies to water, while diffusion, it's seen as a general process for other molecules. But this is misleading, because osmosis is actually a type of diffusion. And in this figure, we're seeing osmosis and diffusion being shown as what looks to be separate processes, which is going to reinforce the idea that they are fundamentally different. And while osmosis and diffusion, while they are going to involve different mechanisms, osmosis is not separate from diffusion. It's actually going to fall under a broader category of diffusion. So in reality, osmosis, it's not separate from diffusion because it's a type of diffusion in which water molecules, they're going to move across a selectively permeable membrane. And diffusion is actually an umbrella term, and diffusion refers to the movement of molecules from high to low concentration. So there's many different kinds of diffusion, and osmosis is one of them. So osmosis is going to follow the same principle of diffusion, but osmosis is going to specifically apply to the movement of water molecules across a selectively permeable membrane, which is what we're seeing here. This is a selectively permeable membrane, and water is moving through it. And the key driving force behind osmosis is the difference in solute concentration. On this side, we have pure water, but on this side, we have a solution. And this pure water, it's moving towards that solution from an area of higher water volume to an area of lower water volume. And this movement occurs from an area of lower solute concentration to an area of higher solute concentration. So it's important that we recognize that diffusion is going to refer to the movement of any molecule from high to low concentration, regardless of whether a membrane is involved. And osmosis, it specifically refers to the movement of water molecules in response to solute concentration through a selectively permeable membrane. And I want to say that both of these processes, they are passive, meaning that they don't require energy input from the cell. So understanding that osmosis is a form of diffusion is going to clarify how cells are able to maintain water balance and why changes in solute concentration affect cell volume. So the last misconception that we're going to talk about is that water molecules stop moving at equilibrium. So this is actually a common misunderstanding in biology because it's thought that when equilibrium is reached, our water molecules stop moving across a membrane. So it's going to be assumed that the system becomes static once we reach equilibrium, but that's not true. When we look at this figure, we see movement, and eventually we reach equilibrium, and it seems like if our molecules are just static in place, that they're not going to be moving back and forth. But in reality, when we do reach equilibrium, our water molecules, they're going to continue moving and they're going to continue going through these membranes. And the key difference between equilibrium being static and dynamic is that there is no net movement of water across the membrane. What happens is that molecules, they're going to continue to cross the membrane in both directions, but the overall concentration on each side is going to remain stable. And our water molecules, they're constantly moving because of their kinetic energy. So molecules, they're always in constant motion because of kinetic energy. And when we're at equilibrium, equal amounts of water are going to be moving in and out, maintaining a balance without changing the total concentration. And this explains why cells don't freeze in place, but instead they maintain a dynamic equilibrium where movement is going to continue, but the concentrations stay stable. Understanding that our equilibrium is dynamic and not static, it's going to just highlight that really fundamental principle of our biological systems, which is that living organisms are constantly adjusting to internal and external changes in order to maintain homeostasis. So to summarize, diffusion is only effective over very short distances, and our larger organisms are going to rely on transport systems to move molecules efficiently. We know that osmosis is a type of diffusion, but it's going to specifically refer to the movement of water across a selectively permeable membrane in response to solute concentration, and that our equilibrium, it's dynamic, meaning that there is continuous movement, and that even when a balance is reached, those molecules are going to continue moving, but there is just no net change in concentration.